Hello, everyone. Before we invite John onto the virtual stage, I just want to provide a bit of background on the occasion for hosting this talk. So 84,000 was born out of a historic conference that was hosted by Kensei Foundation in March of 2009, almost exactly 11 years ago today. Over 50 leading scholars and experts in the field of Buddhist studies congregated in the small Himalayan village of Bir, India, to discuss the preservation of the Tibetan Buddhist Canon. And today's conversation commemorates that conference. It's also our pilot in what we hope to develop into an annual week-long series of talks and seminars that feature scholars, Buddhist teachers, and artists. Now allow me to introduce Dr. John Canty. John is not only the editorial co-director of 84,000, but was in fact also a participant at the 2009 founding meeting and a founding member of 84,000's executive committee. Originally a student of medicine and anthropology at the University of Cambridge, he is also a founding member of the very prolific Padmakara translation group. He has since distinguished himself as a celebrated translator of Buddhist texts and has also studied with some of the greatest Tibetan Buddhist masters of the modern era, including Kangyur Rinpoche, Dudjom Rinpoche, and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Canty. Hello, John. As someone whose research interests has to do with the key figures involved in the creation of the Derge version of the Kangyur and the Tengyur, which is what 84,000 is primarily using as the source text for translating into English, I'm really delighted to be able to talk to you today about the Kangyur. So please take it away and give us a picture of how the Kangyur as we know it today came to be.
Yes, well, thank you, Joy, and thank you everyone for coming along to listen. I don't know about the different continents, but here in Europe, it's a beautiful sunny afternoon, and anybody who's spending their time watching this is very kind, let's say. I hope that we can keep you interested. I have to say, to begin with, my internet connection here, I live in the countryside, is not great. So should I disappear or freeze, don't be too surprised. I'll try to get back as soon as I can. And Joy, yes, it's really great to have you as the kind of very comforting moderator here. I would like to say that, you know, Joy, as well as being part of 84,000's communications team and plays a great role in keeping especially the Chinese part of the site updated and fully informed. Joy is also, as we've fairly recently discovered, incredibly talented in knowing her way around the Chinese Buddhist texts, and has been a huge help to the editorial team when we need to find out something about the Chinese equivalents of some of the texts that we're translating. So it's great to have her here today. Yes, so, well, we've tried to kind of find a catchy title for this talk. So Holy Relic, Time Capsule, or Goldmine. And I think the or is a bit out of place here, really. I think the Kangyur is all of those things. And I want to kind of talk about them all a little bit. We've only got an hour, and I'm supposed to be talking only for part of that. So it's an incredibly short time to cover such a huge subject. So, you know, we're going to have to go a little bit fast and fly over the surface without getting into too much depth. My tendency is always to get stuck in rabbit holes, things that particularly interest me. So Joy will help to kind of keep me going and, you know, make sure that we cover the whole ground in the time. So Joy, please don't hesitate to interrupt if you think I'm going on a bit too long. So first of all, yes, I'm going to take the middle subject, this time capsule business first, and talk a little bit about history, because I'd like to put the Kangyur into a kind of historical, geographical context as far as possible, as far as is possible in a sort of very, very short time. You know, basically, the Kangyur, of course, is Buddhist scriptures. It's the texts. But I think it's very important not to forget that Buddhism as a whole, the Buddha's Dharma, is a living tradition, and always was an oral living tradition. And in fact, for many centuries, the texts were orally transmitted. And as with other spiritual traditions of the time, very little was being written down. And it was only really in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD that a lot of the texts that we're now dealing with first appeared in writing, and they were written down in the languages of India at the time. So in Pali and Sanskrit, probably the first versions were written in some kind of Prakrit, which is a sort of non-classical, if you like, Indic language, various dialects that were being spoken at the time. And they gradually diverged. Some of the different groups of Buddhist communities that were the inheritors of the Buddha's teaching, they kind of split up geographically and sometimes slightly doctrinally too, and they went to different places. And the groups that went south generally tended to take with them the scriptures that had been written down in Pali. And in the north, it was more the texts that were written down in various languages that were akin to Sanskrit, and gradually became turned into kind of more classical Sanskrit to a varying degree. Some of them stayed in this kind of Buddhist hybrid, sometimes called Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. And I think what's really amazing is that the Buddhist texts are among the, for the time, among the kind of greatest exports of India. You know, there was of course a lot of things going on in India. It was a very highly developed classical civilization. I suppose mathematics might be some of the other, one of the other big influences in Asia and in the world in general. I think the Indians invented the zero, which of course made a huge difference to people's knowledge of mathematics worldwide, and the Arabs took it on, and you know, it became a kind of founding feature of mathematics. But perhaps apart from that, the Buddhist teachings were one of the most kind of open-minded, universally applicable things that came out of India at the time. And this is partly because the Buddha himself kind of favored the translation of texts, and they're being made as understandable as possible. So they weren't kind of locked into some sacred classical language. They were made to be understood. Excuse me. So very soon, the teachings and the texts were being carried to different parts, first of all, different parts of India. And in really a relatively short time to different parts of Asia too. So I'm going to try and share a couple of maps here, if I can.
John, while you share the maps, I just want to say that it's really interesting to think about how, I mean, ancient Indian culture was not very preoccupied with writing things down, right? It was a very kind of oral sort of tradition, which is why we have written records from India from quite late compared to other places like China, etc. But perhaps it was kind of the Buddha's open-mindedness and kind of tendency to want things to be recorded in this way, and his encouragement of translation that allowed Buddhist texts to kind of expand the way they did and go across borders. anyway, I think it's interesting because I think a lot of times we forget how much of classical and ancient Indian culture was not written down prior to this time.
Absolutely, yes. I think that's a really important point. And, you know, I think it's also important to remember as we go on that still a lot of what accompanies the texts has not all been written down. You know, Buddhism is very much a living tradition, and it's carried by people and by their understanding and by their knowledge. And of course, books and texts are only part of it. And the two things really go together. So yes, here we've got a map just showing you, of course, and most people would know this, I'm sure, but this relatively small area of India where the Buddha himself actually moved around and taught. And then quite quickly, even, you know, in the 3rd century BC, as here, this is the kind of missions that were sent out by Ashoka, and of course that wasn't the only movement, but what I'm really trying to point out particularly is how quickly the Buddhist teachings got up into this area here. I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer, up into the area of Kashmir and Gandhara, and Khotan and Gilgit, and all of these places up in northwest India, which are in some ways the kind of gateway to India from the rest of the Eurasian continent. And of course, it was through these passes up in this area that people were coming down and invading India later. But for the time being, it was going the other way, you could say. And there were kingdoms and important people and patrons up in these areas who were adopting Buddhist culture and teachings and copying out the texts, and so that this was really very important. And up here is where Buddhism tended to meet the trade routes, and I think it's again quite important to realize how Buddhism would basically spread along trade routes, and I suppose the two ways any kind of culture spreads are through trade and through military conquest. And these are the things that open up people to contact with people from different countries, different places, different cultures, and even different ethnicities. So by the 3rd century BC even, you know, there was a lot going on up here, as it was, of course, in other parts of India, and coming down as well down to what we would now call Burma or Myanmar, and Thailand and so forth was beginning through via the sea routes. And then the next stage was, this is a map of the 1st century AD. So these kind of blue arrows here are the Silk Road trade routes coming in even from Rome and passing through this very important area in northwest India, Gandhara, and Gilgit and so forth. And there are these Silk Road trade routes going through to China very early on. And at the same time, there were these sea routes, the so-called the maritime Silk Roads, where the Buddhist teachings were being carried to different parts of Southeast Asia, probably not a great deal, but in the 1st century, but certainly later on. And the first Chinese translators were actually not Chinese at all. The very first ones were mostly from this area of Central Asia. They were, some of them were Parthians. I think Parthia is this area here, not very far from the Caspian Sea, even quite far west. There was An Shigao and An Zhuan, who were both Parthians, and they were beginning to take Buddhist texts into China along the trade routes by the mid-2nd century. And then Dharmaraksha, oh yes, Lokakshema, again in the middle of the 2nd century, Dharmaraksha, who was from Dunhuang, which is in one of these oasis towns up here on the Silk Road. And of course, a little bit later on in the 4th century, Kumarajiva, and others later on, Xuanzang, Shiksananda, Yijing, Bodhiruchi. So over a long period of time, the texts were coming into China, some overland through these routes and some via the sea. And at the same time, texts were getting into other parts of China, other parts of Asia, sorry. So again, this is how Buddhism reached other parts of Southeast Asia, Vietnam in the 2nd century, Korea in the 4th century. And I was amazed to understand that actually Buddhism reaches Japan even in the 6th century, very far away Japan, a long way from India. And the reason I'm saying all this is, notice this area here in the middle, and this is Tibet. Do you see what I mean? So it's like a kind of dark hole. And it's, in some ways, this is the nearest, the Tibetans were the nearest neighbors of this small area of northeast India where the Buddha was teaching. Of course, there were some formidable geographical barriers, the Himalayan mountain range and the kind of jungles of the what's now the Nepalese Terai. So it wasn't very easy, but there was trade and there were communications. And somehow Tibet, in some ways, you could say, resisted the teachings and the Buddhist culture that was not very far away for quite a long time, while it was all going very far away, sort of in parallel, but around it. So I find that quite interesting, and I don't think we really know why the Tibetans were not sort of cottoning on to the Buddha's teachings earlier, but they weren't anyway. That's all we can say. Until about, the first things that we hear about in the traditional histories are probably, they're semi-legendary, but the first things we hear about are kind of in the 5th century. This King Latotori, who sort of saw some texts and thought that they were wonderful, but didn't really know much about what they were. And then it's really only in Songtsen Gampo's time, so this is 7th century, that there was some serious thought, at least in central Tibet, about what are these texts, what is this Buddhist teaching? And of course, Songtsen Gampo is kind of renowned as the first of the great Dharma kings who was really interested in adopting Buddhist culture, and he built these temples around the sort of periphery of the kingdom. And he sent his one of his ministers, this scholar called Termi Sambota, again, a slightly mythical figure, to study languages. Probably went to Kashmir, and it's said that there were some couple of texts, at least, that were translated in that time. So these were the first translations into Tibetan of Buddhist texts, the Ratnamega Sutra and the Ratnaketu Dharani. And so probably at that time, there were Tibetans who were traveling down into India, studying, bringing back the texts. Were they really going down directly into India? Were they going via Kashmir? We don't know a great deal. And then coming now to the sort of 8th century, we have, of course, the famous King Trisong Detsen, the second of the great Dharma kings. Actually, it seems that even in his father's time, this king called Megatsom or Tride Sugtsen, the teachings were beginning to be translated a little bit more. There's a record of the great translator, became later the great translator Jnanakumara, who went to see this great Buddhist master called Buddha Guya and another one called Buddha Shanti, who were actually doing a retreat on Mount Kailash which is very interesting. And they were invited to Tibet to come and teach and bring texts and so forth. And they kind of were reluctant to do so. They were in retreat and they refused, but they sent some very interesting letters, which are in the Tenjur, sorry, to the king. And some people say that during that time, the Karma Shataka, the 100 deeds, was translated into Tibetan for the first time. And there may have been more texts than we think were being translated, and not always from Sanskrit. Some of them may have been, the translation may have started from Chinese, because there were also texts coming back from China, back westwards into Tibet. But again, we don't know a lot about it. And then, of course, we come to the great classical period of the early translation with Trisong Detsen and his sons and grandsons, down to Relpa. So we have Trisong Detsen and two of his sons who may have taken the throne, and then Senalek and Relpa. And that was the great time of the sort of imperially sponsored translations. And the Tibetans might have been late on the game, but when they did it, they really did it thoroughly, you know, and they took in these vast numbers of texts, and within 100 years, they'd translated practically all of the main Mahayana sutras and the Veneer texts and the Prajnaparamita and a lot of what we now see as being the contents of the Kangyur. And so that went on for, as I say, about 100 years, until the end of the reign of Relpa. And that was the sort of end of what's called the first translation period. And it is really quite amazing what they had done in that time. And at the end of, again, during Relpa reign, we had this wonderful document called the Mahavyutpati, which is a sort of glossary and dictionary of instructions of how to translate texts from Sanskrit into Tibetan, and determining the terminology. And, you know, it was a highly organized and really very efficient process that went on. And then it all came to an end for about 200 years, you know, according to the traditional histories. We don't really know all the details, but there was the famous King Langdama, who was anti-Buddhist, you could say, and didn't want all of this to continue. And the imperial power sort of declined, and it really, as far as we know, not a great deal of translation went on for some time. And then it all started up again in what's now called the late period, and beginning in the 11th century. And so we have the patronage of this king in Western Tibet called Lama Yeshue. And he sent people, especially Rinchen Zangpo and some of the other scholars of the time, to Kashmir, where they studied Sanskrit, and they brought back texts. And then there was a whole sequence of different translators, the two Ngoks, Ngok Likpe Sherab and Ngok Lodin Sherab, who both studied in Kashmir. They were uncle and nephew, founded the monastery of Sangpu, brought back lots of text. And then Drokmi, who was basically behind the very founding of the Sakya tradition, and Bari Lotsawa. And then, of course, the very well-known stories of Marpa going to India, going to Nepal first and going to India and receiving teachings from Naropa, who'd received them from Tilopa, and the beginnings of the Kagyu tradition as well. So there was these two sort of main periods, the early and late translation. And they were producing all of these texts, or the translations of all of these texts. And what I think people don't realize is that there was still no Kangyur, actually, at that time. At the end of that time, let's say the 12th, 13th century, there were lots of translated texts in monastery libraries, and they were being copied and spread and placed in different places, but very much, everyone would have their own selection according to their interest, according to their lineage. And it was really only in the 14th century that people suddenly began to think, well, this could be a kind of unified collection. And thanks to work that was being done in the monastery of Natang by Chomden Rigpe Reltri, this was in the 13th century, and then the monastery of Tsel Gungtang and Shalu, which was the seat of Bhutan, a little bit later than the other ones. This is some kind of very late 13th century, early 14th century. They began to find out what there was. There had been some lists in the imperial period, which were very important, are still available, very important historical documents, so that we know what had been translated in those early times. And they found, the best copies of things. They'd made lists, tried to arrange them, according to genre and subject and period and translations and so forth. And they began to evolve what we now call the Kangyur. And so, to kind of, and they actually began to be printed and, became sort of definitive set. So I'm sorry, that's a real quick flyover of the history.
No. Yeah, I know, John, there's so much more that could be said about that history and so many more sort of details and interesting things to divulge. Maybe in the interest of time, I mean, it's so fascinating to think about how Tibet was kind of the last great civilization in the ancient world to be exposed to Buddhism, but when embraced, it kind of embraced it with all of its fervor, and then of course we often don't think about how usually the canonization or codification of a canon happens centuries after the first exposure, right? So of course, in the case of Tibet, that was also the case, and it was a very long process of people organizing and sorting through the text to get to what we today know as the Kangyur, or at least the versions of the Kangyur and Tengyur that we have. So maybe if you've kind of provided us with this very fascinating history of how these texts came to Tibet, and they kind of, but like you mentioned earlier, even though they kind of are a capsule in time, they're not a fossil either, right? Because they represent a living tradition. So do you think that you could take us through some of the ways that the Kangyur was and still is actually used and venerated?
Yes, I mean, that's, I think it's very interesting that, with hindsight, we can see that the Kangyur was sort of brought to Tibet and was frozen in time, like a sort of time capsule of everything that was available in that period, let's say from the 7th through to the 13th century. It's very easy for us with hindsight to see that, well, then the Dharma almost disappeared from India. The sort of invaders came in from the West, the Turkic armies and invaders, and destroyed Nalanda, for example, the great university of Nalanda at the very end of the 12th century. And so, of course, by then, a lot of the teachings had been taken and translated and preserved in Tibet, but the Tibetans didn't necessarily know that was what they were doing at the time. And so it's very fortuitous, that all of those, the Tibetans may have imagined that they would continue being able to bring in texts from India, but of course they couldn't, and that was it, So suddenly the source of these scriptures was sort of sealed off. And Tibet being again a very isolated place, the scriptures were sort of preserved there, and they were studied, and they were certainly used tremendously, but they were preserved there for, 1,000 years, or many centuries anyway. And so they represent what was available at the time and the state that the text had reached in the kind of evolution, because of course, what people were interested in, the kind of texts that were being favored, changes over time, and so what the Tibetans translated, what they preserved, represents for us an important idea of what there was circulating then. But I think it's also very important to remember that we might kind of look at it as a sort of time capsule, something that's preserved in history, but at the same time it has its own history, it has its own antecedents, and it continued to be transmitted. And the whole idea of lineage is terribly important for the scriptures, and that's really the why the Kangyur is held in such incredible reverence by the living tradition, and still is. And it's something that was very important to sort of preserve that aspect of the living tradition. And the scriptures of the Kangyur were treated in a slightly different way from the scriptures of the Tengyur. And I think this is a kind of a real key to understanding why the Kangyur is so important to us now. The Tengyur, of course, represents all of the treatises that the great Indian scholars extracted, if you like, from the raw material of the Kangyur, of the sayings of the Buddha. The teachings of the Buddha are a little bit like a sort of recorded Dharma talks, by a great teacher. And they were addressed to particular people in particular times and places. And what the treatises did was to extract from those Dharma talks, if you like, a kind of much more systematized presentation of what the Buddha intended to say. So you could have teachings grouped, in according to different philosophical points of view that he taught, according to different subjects, according, whether it's about how the mind works, whether it's about how one should behave, whether it's about how bodhisattvas should progress on the path. He answered all kinds of questions on different topics, and all of those different subjects were kind of grouped in the treatises. And these were the kind of primary access, and always have been in Tibet, the sort of primary access which people actually studied. And the Kangyur itself, although, certain individual lamas were particularly interested in and studied it very carefully, but it was never really taught as such in monastic colleges, and people generally didn't read the sutras very much. They read about their contents in the systematized treatises, and so the Kangyur remained sometimes unused in a way. It was a kind of great object of reverence because it represented the Dharma. And I say I'm putting these in the past tense, but of course this is still the case. It represents the Buddha's teachings, and in some ways it's the kind of bedrock of all of the ways that Buddhist teachings used. And without it, there would be no kind of stable base. So it's incredibly important, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's used and studied. And one of the main ways that you find the Kangyur being used in later Tibetan writings is as a source of quotations. So really, anybody who's writing about the Buddhist teachings would always want to back up everything they say by reference to the scriptures, to the Buddha's word. It's a little bit like now in science, if you're going to make a statement, you have to anything that you present as fact has to be based on somebody's findings before you. So in some ways the Kangyur represents that sort of database, if you like, of the Buddha's statements, which are terribly important to prevent people from just sort of inventing some kind of new stuff, of their own accord, right, but keeping the whole thing tethered to to the Buddhist teachings.
Yeah, I think if
So,
anyone who's anyone who's read any sort of Tibetan Buddhist scholastic writing will know exactly what you're talking about, John, where the quotes just abound. But the interesting thing is that often they'll indicate that a citation is happening by like an abbreviated name of the sutra. And it's not like our modern citation system where you provide all of bibliographical details. And so that also indicates to me that even though in the monastic system, there wasn't that much formal study of the Kangyur itself, it was more the Tenjur, but it meant that anyone who was learned, you were expected to be able to draw on this knowledge from the Kangyur. And if you were a knowledgeable reader reading it, it was assumed that you would figure out which sutra we're talking about, right? Like we're not, if the writer is not going to give you a detailed bibliographic note, you should know which sutra we're talking about.
that's right. That's right. So I think there were always specialists in the Kangyur who would know where to find these things. But a lot of the knowledge about the Kangyur was transmitted through the treatises and later writings, commentaries, and so forth that sort of assumed that was that was the basis. But at the same time, it was very important to keep the Kangyur alive, and to keep the links with with its lineage going right back to the Buddha's teachings in India. And I think it's just for example, one of my main teachers, Kangyur Rinpoche. It's no accident that he's called Kangyur Rinpoche. He was very well known for holding a huge number of lineages of the Kangyur transmission. And the Kangyur transmission, the Kangyur Lung, was an event that people would come to, and where you would sit down and listen to the Lama, in this case Kangyur Rinpoche, reciting the whole Kangyur as a formalized transmission. And he gave, Kangyur Rinpoche gave the transmission of the Kangyur Lung 26 times during his life, which is incredible.
That is amazing.
And there are, of course, now, I think the last time he did it was in the 1950s, still in Tibet. I don't think he did it in India. Of course, it has been done since then quite a few times in India. There are other lamas who are sort of specialists in that. But I think that is considered incredibly important to keep that transmission going. And you will find in the texts, most of the great lamas who left their complete works would leave a volume or two recording exactly who they'd received the transmission from, and also going all the way back, who that person had received it from, who that person had received it from, going all the way back to at least to the arrival of the texts in Tibet. And the names were all listed, and can be verified. They all, and so that kind of link was extremely important.
Right. John, in the interest of time, I know it's going so quickly. Could you just give us one example for, something interesting from one of the sutras that you've been working on, or that you've kind of overseen from the Kangyur? Maybe a kind of, going with the Goldmine kind of theme, a nugget of some, as it were, of wisdom, or something that you found particularly interesting. Just one example, maybe, before we go on to the question and answer segment.
Yes, I'm sorry. There were all kinds of things I would have loved to say about the way the Kangyur is revered and how it's used, but we're going to run out of time. So yes, one of the things I thought would be quite interesting, again, one of the things that we can do today is having a translation of the Kangyur makes it easy to look for these quotes that are so famous and to see what kind of context they appeared in. And that's very interesting for in many cases, and quite surprising sometimes. But one of the things that I wanted to show you, actually I wanted to show you several different examples of how well-known quotes appear in quite unexpected places. And one of the things that I'm sure most people who have had anything to do with Tibetan Buddhism have heard about, and even other kinds of even other traditions of Buddhism, is the famous formula Ye Dharma Hetu Prabhava, which explains how the Buddha taught that all phenomena have a cause, and he taught what their cause is and how to reach a cessation. So this is a formula in Sanskrit which has been sort of carved into rocks and put in stupas and on the back of statues and everything all over the Buddhist world. So where does it come from? And this is very interesting. It's actually not originally the words of the Buddha himself, not directly anyway. And here I wanted to talk more about the kind of contents of the Kangyur, but one of the very, very interesting parts is the Veneer Texts. And these make up the first 10 or so volumes of the Kangyur. And they are the record of the so-called Mula Sarvastavadin Vinaya tradition, which is one of several different Vinaya traditions that spread from the Buddha's original teachings. And they contain, as most people think, they contain mainly the rules for the monks, which is true, but they also explain all about the history of why those rules arose and why they were necessary. So the Veneer texts are full of incredibly interesting stories, biographies, and in fact the whole life story of the Buddha can be found in the first of these texts, which is in the Kangyur, called the Veneer Vastu, which has 17 chapters. And the first chapter we've actually translated. There are other ones coming quite soon on the way. The first chapter is about the ordination of monks, or what we'd call the going forth of monks. And it actually, a vast amount of it is taken up with the story of how Shariputra and Moggallana became the Buddha's disciples. They were young Brahmins who kind of were really interested in the spiritual search, and they wandered around meeting different teachers and not finding quite satisfactory answers to their questions. And then one day they meet one of the Buddha's first disciples, who's called Ashvajit, and he is a wonderful monk. He was actually one of the Buddha's 5 companions when he himself was seeking the truth before his enlightenment. And Ashvajit has been sent by the Buddha, who knows that he's going to meet these 2 young Brahmin seekers. And these words are spoken by him. I'll try and share my screen, show you the actual text. So this is the chapter on going forth from the Vinaya Vastu, and I think I've got a bookmark here. So this wonderful sort of example of the Buddha's disciples called Asvajit comes along, and he says these words, which are the actual words of the mantra. Those phenomena that arise from causes, the Tathagata himself has taught that they have a cause and also a cessation. The great Shramana is the one who thus proclaims. So this is how those words appeared in the text, and they were incredibly inspiring to Shariputra, who was called Kolita, and his friend Upatishya, who became Moggallana. And they both, just hearing these words, already attained a kind of level of realization. And Ashvajit took them to see the Buddha, and they, immediately became his disciples, and the rest is history, as it were. So it's really very interesting to find this sort of thing, which has almost become a mantra, in this story from the Veneer Texts, which is perhaps a not very expected place to find it. There is another text which talks about this same formula. This is called the Sutra on Dependent Arising, and in this text, the Buddha speaks the same words. Ye Dhamma Hetu Prabhava Hetuntem Tesam Tathagata Hayavit Tesham Chayi Naroda Evam Vadi Mahashramana. And in this case, it's about putting it into stupas. So this is a kind of later thing. And lo and behold, very, very interesting, because when you read about who was present at this teaching that the Buddha gave, one of the main characters here is Ashvajit. But there's no other mention in the text that he was the original speaker of this, of this particular sentence.
Right.
So, that's just one of the many interesting things that I would have liked to show you. And I'm so sorry we're going to run out of time and not allow any time for questions unless I stop at great length. But
no, not at all. I think that was a perfect example, kind of to show how interesting it is to actually look at the Kangyur and be able to contextualize certain things that we take for granted, like the Ye Dharma, right? Prior to this, I had never really given thought to where this comes from in the scriptures. And it's so interesting to see how where the verse occurs in the sutras is itself kind of so interesting. It leads two of Buddha's great disciples to actually become his disciples. Anyway, it's very interesting. And I think, shall we move on to questions? I think we have a little bit of time. We have a little bit of time for questions. I'm just looking through. We've gotten lots of good questions. We will probably only have time for 2 questions, so apologies to everyone who is here, but we will try to get through them. We have a question here about how the 84,000 project might compare to the Tibetans in terms of their productivity in translating. And how do you think the undertaking that 84,000 is kind of doing right now might compare to the imperial period, for example, when they were trying to translate the canon? Well, this is from Natalia.
Well, thank you, Natalia. That's a very interesting question. And of course, it's a little bit embarrassing to compare ourselves to that incredible period of the great translators, because, there were some amazing people involved then who were very highly realized, accomplished practitioners. And they were working with panditas, highly accomplished scholars who'd come from India. And there was a whole process going on, which was way above the kind of things that we could ever claim to be doing. But in some ways, yes, we hope that within 100 years, we can translate the whole of the Kangyur and the whole of the Tengyur. And we hope that even in 25 years, we can get through almost all of the Kangyur and some related Tengyur texts. So in terms of time, perhaps, it'll be a bit of a rush job and very imperfect. We are very lucky because we can publish electronically. So we can keep improving our translations. And actually the Tibetans did this too, as far as we know. There was a great period of revision later on in the first period. And they, of course, it was more difficult for them because they had to copy everything out by hand. This was before the age of printing. So later on, when Kangyurs had to be revised, it had to be carved in wood. So now, digital publishing is making our life a lot easier. But one thing I would like to say here is that, I think it'll be some time before we can say that what we're producing in English is scriptures.
Mm.
I think it's very interesting how the Tibetans saw really quite early on the translations that had been made into Tibetan as actually representing the Dharma and being a sort of holy scripture. And I would feel very uncomfortable if people did that to our English translations at the moment, So I think we will want to keep our translations quite closely tied to the original source texts for kind of safety. We wouldn't want people to think that we've produced a sort of definitive, perfect translation, because that's far from the case. But anyway, just to say that we are doing our best. And the project, of course, does have some parallels, but I would like to sort of maintain a very humble profile for on behalf of all of our team, because we're not really in the same league.
Thank you. I think for the final question, let's take a question that is related to the content of the Kangyur. So we have a question from Sergio. He's asking, he says, he knows that there's information on the relationship between the Chinese Agamas and the Pali Nikayas, and how much of the Kangyur, or how many texts are paralleled or commonly present in these three collections. So the Chinese Agamas, the Pali Nikayas, and the Kangyur.
There's actually quite a lot more overlap between the Chinese Tripitaka and the Pali Canon, because a lot of what's in the Pali Canon, as Sergio quite rightly says, is present in the Agamas, which are the equivalent of the Nikayas. In the Kangyur, those texts aren't really present as such. There is quite a lot of parallel texts that you can find, especially in the Vinaya, actually, which represents, if you like, the Shravakayana, the non-Mahayana part of the Kangyur. And so we can find a lot of passages in the Veneer texts which are paralleled in the Agamas and in the Nikayas. And of course, the basic material is very similar. But there's really very little overlap between the Kangyur and the Pali Canon. And the big exception is there are 13 texts which are usually grouped in, strangely enough, in the Prajnaparamita volume, which are called the 13 late translated texts, and are the only part of the Kangyur that were actually translated, as far as we know, from Pali by a Sri Lankan monk who turned up quite amazingly in Western Tibet at the monastery of Tolung in the 14th century, and translated probably from memory with the help of a Tibetan translator, the texts that he brought with him. And these were the very last texts that were ever added to the Kangyur.
That's very interesting. So I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions, but we did get a lot of questions related to translation, the project of translation, the kind of principles that go into translation. And I think, John, you are uniquely positioned to kind of, you have a very unique perspective, being an editor and a translator yourself. So I mean, maybe in the future we can host a session that's just dedicated to that topic, because I do feel that deserves its own conversation. What goes into determining what did Tibetans and other Buddhist civilizations do when they sat down and decided to translate? How did they fix it later? And what principles and kind of guiding ideas went into that? I think that deserves its own conversation. So we won't be able to answer those questions today, unfortunately, but everyone who asked a question like that.
I would really like to just add, conclude that translating is one of the best ways of studying. And to me, to be involved in this editorial work and translation work of the Kangyur has been an incredible period for me to actually study and discover what's in the Kangyur. And I'm more and more full of respect for what there is, the incredible material there is. There are so many things that we could find, and I had all kinds of things that I was planning to say about the ways that we might want to use the Kangyur in our day, and the kind of things that we might find in it that would be really interesting and useful in the 21st century. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I spent too much time talking about history, perhaps. But I think, honestly, we have material here for a really substantial number of talks of this kind. So I hope that there'll be an opportunity to go into more detail in some of it.
Definitely.
In the future.
Definitely.
Hopefully in the near future.
Definitely. Thank you so much, John. And that's all we have time for today, but thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insight with us. And thank you to all the participants joining us from all over the world. Please stay tuned for more conversations like this. We will keep you posted if we host other talks like this. And take care. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.